Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
£9 billion a year is the likely cost to the Treasury of Boris Johnson's income tax plans alone, with the wealthiest households seeing the biggest gains, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Changes to national insurance could cost billions more. Our political correspondent Ross Hawkins has been looking into the would-be Prime Minister's domestic promises.
The new Prime Minister heads down the Mall towards Downing Street, so let's go straight there.
In just a month's time, this scene could play out for real.
And we can see the outriders entering right now as the new Prime Minister sweeps into Downing Street.
It's a measure of the resilience.
And once Prime Minister Johnson was inside number 10, what then?
This is a very big policy indeed.
Well, the biggest idea in detail so far, to raise the point people pay income tax at the higher rate from £50,000 to £80,000 at a cost, the Institute for Fiscal Studies says this morning, of £9 billion. From the IFS, Paul Johnson.
Most of the money actually goes to people in the richest 10% of households. On average, the richest 10% gain about £2,500 a year.
Boris Johnson's team says he'll focus on reducing tax for working families. He's talked about changing national insurance rules, though we don't have any details yet.
The injustice of our education funding gap.
Instead, it's education where cash is promised. A modest increase for secondary schools in England so far, but more spending announcements, I'm told, to come, aiming to undo education cuts made from 2015.
Everyone will immediately shout that it's not enough. What you're not going to get is a chorus of, thank you, this is amazing, this is exactly what we've been waiting for our whole lives.
Rachel Wolfe, a former number 10 education advisor, who also notes...
Once you decide that you're willing to spend more public money, so you're willing to loosen the controls that have been in place for many years, then your ability to do things that are popular, well-regarded, makes some difference, even when you have virtually no majority, massively expands.
And spending more does seem to be the idea. There'd be a review of the HS2 project with a politician involved in the planning, tells me, significant announcements to come about transport links in the north of England, infrastructure.
It is absurd that Spain should have 80% coverage of fibre optic broadband against only 7% in this country.
Though cash alone won't buy success. The whole of the country on fibre broadband in 5 years, Boris Johnson says. Stian Westlake, former Conservative advisor in the business department, on how civil servants may respond.
The first thing a Prime Minister will find if they try and do something difficult like that is a wall of inertia. They will find the civil service present them with a lot of policy problems that are potentially presented as happening in the past, and this stuff will at first appear impenetrable.
So, he says, you need policy expertise to know which details matter, to convince people you're serious. A challenge Boris Johnson's opponents say is well beyond him. But then the last new Prime Minister had her own dreams for her premiership.
And we will make Britain a country that works not for a privileged few, but for every one of us.
All undone by a failed general election campaign, then a failed Brexit plan.
It was palpable, the loss of influence. It was like sort of something invisible had drained out of the system, and instructions would come in and they would be, people would look at them, they would kind of think, maybe we'll do that, maybe we'll not do that. It was like nothing I've ever seen before.
A sobering political fate that would lie waiting for Boris Johnson's domestic policies if he couldn't solve the Brexit riddle that so confounded Theresa May.
Ross Hawkins reporting. Well, in our Westminster studio is one of Mr Johnson's supporters, James Brokenshire, the Communities Secretary. Good morning, Mr Brokenshire.
Good morning, Michelle.
Do you agree with a tax change in which most of the money goes to people in the richest 10% of households?
Well, I think there are a few things to say on this. Firstly, that this is just one part of what Boris Johnson is looking at. He's not come forward with, for example, changes in relation to the national insurance thresholds, which I think even the IFS has acknowledged that would make the most difference to those on the lowest incomes. It's also worth recognising there's around £26.6 billion of fiscal headroom that's been acknowledged by the Chancellor, and therefore I think this is premature in terms of course, wanting to set out what the analysis is, what that vision is. We're still at the early stages, and there's still more that Boris will want to announce.
£26 billion of fiscal headroom. Do you agree with spending a third of that on a tax change in which most of the money would go to people in the richest 10% of households?
Well, it's equally worth pointing out that this government itself have made changes to the different thresholds, and why
Mr. Brokenshire, do you agree with this change, which is the first thing that Boris Johnson has put forward in terms of his tax proposals?
Taking people out of different tax issues, I think, is an important part of what conservatism is about, actually ensuring that you have more money that you're able to spend for yourselves. But that's why this does need to be seen as part of an overall package of what we do for those people.
Well, we don't have details of the overall package. One of the parts we do have is it's a significant change in which most of the money would go to people in the richest 10% of households. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and I do agree with raising the thresholds, as we have done as a government, in terms of looking at the higher rate bands, because of the fact of what's known as fiscal drag and taking more and more people into that higher rate. Over 30 years, we've seen it raise from about 1.5 million to 4 million, involving people like heads of particular areas in schools, as well as inspectors of the police. That is the point. But the point I'm also making is that this should not be seen in isolation, and therefore the work that we will continue to do to ensure that there is that support for those on the lowest incomes. Indeed, the way in which Boris Johnson championed the London living wage when he was Mayor of London.
When will we know that? When will we know, for example, how he's going to change national insurance?
Well, that will be something that Boris will announce in due time. I'm not
obviously,
going to...
But when? You are supporting him, when are we going to have that detail?
I am supporting him, but Boris is now setting out a number of different themes. You've obviously highlighted, for example, investment in digital infrastructure, the issue of schools as well, and there will be further series of programmes
digital infrastructure. How much is his broadband plan going to cost?
Well, that's obviously something that we have through the National Productivity Investment Fund that we're already investing into, and how there is additionality in providing that fibre. And again, those details will be provided in due course.
Okay, the current plan from the government that you are part of is one that will cost up to £5 billion. He would bring the time frame for that forward by 10 years, which would mean it would cost more. Do you know how much more?
I haven't got the details in front of me this morning, Michelle, but it is those details that we will cost as part of the spending review, actually setting out what the timeline is, because you're right, it is about capital expenditure, and therefore the amounts that we have available to us with that balance there.
Have you asked him how much it would cost?
I've not spoken to him directly about that, because Boris is setting out his own plans as he's advancing all of this, and it is that agenda that is being put forward on getting in our infrastructure.
I imagine in your job, and part of your job is looking after local government, you know exactly what the cuts in local government have meant. You must have council leaders coming to you all the time, making it clear the services that they have had to cut. And yet you are supporting a man where we do not know the detail of how he would choose to allocate the fiscal headroom that you say there is. I mean, I would imagine that you would be making the case for him to make his first pledges into things like social care.
Oh, absolutely. There are big issues on social care, and therefore how, as part of the programme develops, I do expect Boris to be able to set that out.
Just clearly not his priorities, because he hasn't brought it out yet.
I think the thing is, Michelle, you're looking at a campaign for obviously for him to be elected as leader of the Conservative Party, and therefore how you sequence announcements, but equally setting out that much bigger vision, that positive vision for our country that I'm clear that Boris is able to do, and looking at his record as Mayor of London.
Do you agree with him?
That's the point.
Do you agree with him that the backstop is unnecessary?
I think that there is a clear need to change the arrangements on the Northern Ireland Protocol, as it's called, because we've not been able to get this through Parliament. Now, I think it's a question of what assurance we're able to provide to the Irish government and to the EU, and standing behind our commitments under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which remain absolutely resolute.
You used to be one of the people who would go out again and again. You used to be Northern Ireland Secretary, say there has to be a backstop arrangement in place. It is an assurance policy that needs to be there.
And
were you wrong then?
And that's why I make the point on assurance to the Irish government on our continuing commitments on North-South cooperation, on the three-stranded approach under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We've obviously sought to provide certain measures through the negotiations thus far, but the reality is that has now been rejected 3 times by Parliament, and therefore the need to reassess to ensure that we are able to provide that frictionless border and get back into those discussions with our EU colleagues. And of course, you will push back and say, well, people aren't prepared to negotiate. I think that if you look at what we're hearing from Europe, there is that need for that flexibility because people want to make this deal happen, and that's where we need to be focused.
James Brokenshire, thank you.
Thank you.